The first thing that I want to say is that the interview that comes at the end of the book, which was published in Frontline, is the only piece of writing that is done actually for the Indian readership. The both other essays, which originally were published in Socialist Register, were written very much for an international audience, international readership, including, of course, the readership in India that reads things like Socialist Register. I bring this up partly because the main text on which the book itself is takes the title of that essay on India, liberal democracy, and the extreme right. Because it was written essentially for a foreign audience, goes over a lot of material that I may not have included in this form had I written it for an Indian readership. So some of it in that sense. At the same time, I must say that that particular essay itself came at a particular point that I'll talk to you about. But I've been writing on the issue of communalism and creeping right-wing extremism in India since 1992, since the Babri Masjid demolition area. And it was at that time in my essay entitled On the Ruins of Ayodhya that I basically formulated the perspective which I have been developing over the years. So I have published some 10, 12, I forget how many essays since then. And what has happened then is that as new events occur, and as I revisit my own thoughts, I keep modifying the propositions that I had put forward in the early 90s, late 90s. This essay was written in response very much to the elections of 2014, which brought Modi to power. And the immediate concerns that I had, which I wanted to spell out, was, first of all, I felt that those elections indicated the terminal decline, irreversible decline of the Congress party, a party that had dominated Indian politics for over a century, had arrived at a point from where I thought it was not going to recover in any foreseeable future, maybe never. That I thought was a very, very, very important turning point in India. The other thing that I had been watching before writing this essay was that despite the Gujarat pogroms and despite everything else that Modi had done, he had increasingly become the favorite prime ministerial candidate, both for the big corporate bourgeoisie. In fact, I do not remember the Indian big bourgeoisie coalescing together behind any one prime minister quite as strongly as they did behind Modi, even before he got elected. In fact, their support was extremely important for his getting elected. But also that for years before the 2014 elections, the polls being taken in things like India Today and Outlook and so on that were being published were indicating that Modi was emerging as the leading candidate to become the Prime Minister of India. I assume that journals of this kind, their polls indicate very heavily how the urban middle classes are thinking. The well-heeled urban middle classes are, I think, the ones they really poll. So what was emerging by the time the elections came was that Modi had become the unrivaled candidate from premiership for India for the rule of property in India. All scales of property had coalesced behind him. I also felt at that time that the Vajpayee dispensation in the past was a transitional moment for the Sangh Parivar, in which they wanted to establish themselves the legitimacy as a party of rule, and would play by and played very much by the rules of liberal democracy. Now, my feeling was that this was going to be increasingly more and more an RSS government. And that the BJP, of course, itself is actually a very well-oiled political machine. And at the same time, it is also a political front among other fronts of the RSS. And that the coordination among the various fronts had been very impressive, diabolically impressive, but very impressive the way various fronts were functioning. So that in that particular article, I also had to sort of fill in some of the background for the RSS and so on, which all of us in India are very familiar with. But that was a historic moment. I thought it was an absolute turning point in Indian history. And at that time, very few of my friends and comrades agreed with me that the Congress was now terminally ill and it was not going to come back to power. And therefore, my prediction was that this BJP RSS rule is going to be there for quite a while. It's going to be stable. It was going to be the party of rule, and slowly and gradually the full program of the RSS would be implemented. Slowly and gradually. I also felt that in the way the extreme right had emerged all over Europe and the United States, India was going to get a lot, Modi's India was going to get a lot of support from the United States. And that no matter what they do to the minorities or intellectuals or activists or whatever, they were not going to face too much pressure from around the world. So it was in that sort of moment that that article was written. I had in my mind the idea that what was happening in India was very much a part of what was happening in the world at large. And the essential background for the rise of the, what I call extreme right, and I'll come to this phrase, extreme right, if I remember. I think the essential background to it is actually the defeat of the communist states. the dissolution of the USSR. It's a historic term, not only in India, but all over the world, the rise of the right and the left being very much on the defensive everywhere else in the world. That issue of what the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Allied states has meant for us actually comes up much more in my other essay on nationalism and extreme capitalism. I want to say briefly a word about this term. I just realized today that both my articles use the word extreme in its titles. I never realized it. When Perry Anderson read my India essay, he said, but you have not defined what you mean by extreme right. My answer to that is that this is a right which is not only deeply anti-communist, not only deeply connected to rule of property and all that, but it is precisely the fact that it combines its institutional work within the liberal democratic framework with relentless use of violence against very many very many social forces, minorities, of course, particularly, but not only the minorities. So it is that combination, what I have said in my articles, that what we are dealing with is the emergence of a very new kind, very different kind of state all over the capitalist world, more or less, a great many places in the capitalist world, which combine the institutional framework of liberal democracy, as well as some of the salient features of what we know as fascism. So it's a sort of a combination of the two. And of course, what is likely to happen in India and what we are witnessing is that the balance between liberalism and fascism is shifting. It is becoming more and more illiberal, what the Hungarian head of state calls illiberal democracy, and all that. This essay, the essay on India, liberal democracy and the extreme right, it was actually reprinted in India a couple of places before, including Frontline, before you put it together in this book. Hello. Sorry. But the other essay has not been published in India like that. So I'm very glad that you have made it available to the Indian readers at a price that many people can actually afford instead of what Socialist Register costs and so on. So I'm very pleased about that. There again, there were 2 or 3 different issues that I was asked to address. Leo Panich, who edits Social Scientist, said that we are going to do an issue on the rise of the right across the world, and can you give us an overall essay that will speak to the phenomenon entirely. But when I got the message, there was a lot about nationalism and neoliberalism and so on. So one problem is that in the West now, the word nationalism is taken to be entirely and absolutely right-wing obscurantist position and so on and so forth. In India, of course, we have historically associated nationalism with anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and so on. So that had to be clarified for a Western audience, that there are progressive nationalism, there are progressive nationalism, there are fascism is a nationalism, national liberation movements of the communists are also national, and so on. So the whole issue of nationalism was addressed briefly in that article. The other thing, going back to something I just said a little earlier, throughout the West, whatever left there is in any Western country, all shades of it are included in what I'm going to say. None of them ever understand what the cost to progressive causes or the cost to people's movements or the cost of to the revolutionary movements in the world has been of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Throughout Western left, there's a complete indifference to what it has meant for revolutionary movements in the rest of the world. And so that one of my major emphases in that essay was that neoliberalism itself could not have succeeded nearly as well. It could not have lasted nearly as well, except in the perspective of the consequences of the defeat of the communist state system. It is what happens to the working classes. The working classes of the formerly socialist countries were left with completely no security, no employment, this, that, and the other. And essentially what happens is that an immensely large working class from the socialist countries, formerly socialist countries, becomes available for super exploitation, which then leads to the great fall of the wage rate around the world, which then leads to a much higher level of accumulation for the 1%, as they're called, for the great big corporate bourgeoisie of the advanced capitalist countries. So I spent quite a bit of time talking about that, essentially having an argument with Western left. We in India understand very much what it has meant for people of the tricontinent. But there is an actual very material relationship between the success of neoliberalism, the rise of this far right. It is only because the communist state system was defeated that the bourgeoisies of all countries in the world are hell-bent to take back from the working classes everything that the working classes had won over the last 100 years. So the class offensive is so immense. What they talk about, economic crisis, this, that, and the other, is the crisis of the working classes, of the working people, of 90% of people who are suffering from it. The big capital is having a grand time. So this kind of redistribution of wealth, undoing the gains that the working classes had made over 100 years during the period of communist ascendancy, is in fact the actual background for the rise of the far right. The interview was conducted just before the elections of 2019, but then published after it. We can talk about that. I think I've talked long enough, longer than I thought I would. Thank you very, very much.